Dragon Quest XI Echoes of an Elusive Age serves as my first introduction into the Dragon Quest franchise, and with me being such a major JRPG fan, my expectations for this title were relatively high, and it needed to make a very first good impression on me. But while I feel that this game did succeed gameplay-wise in providing me with a fun experience, when it comes to the game's story, there was just so much lacking here with little to no originality that I find myself hesitant on even giving another entry in this franchise, past or future, a try. Now, the game's plot takes place in the world of Andrea, and shortly after the main protagonist is born in the kingdom of Dundrasul, it is attacked by an army of monsters. But as an infant, the main protagonist eventually falls into the river and is found by an old man who lives in a small village, and for the next 18 years grows up as a regular peasant. But soon after completing his final rite of passage, your foster mother reveals the truth about your past and some small information about the mysterious birthmark you have. Knowing this, the protagonist sets off to meet the king of another kingdom, and it is here that you are immediately thrown into the dungeon, and after talking to your fellow cellmate who is a thief named Eric, he tells you that your birthmark is the sign of the Luminary, who is known as a hero of legend and is destined to save the world from evil. After escaping the dungeon with Eric, the two of you set out on an adventure and recover 6 magical orbs, and when used together will grant the Luminary access to a magical floating tree in the sky, which there lies a magical sword that you will use to defeat the Dark Lord, and along the way you are joined by a collection of various allies, which range from a pair of magical twins that have sworn to fight alongside the Luminary, a circus performer seeking an adventure and wants to make all people of the land smile, your grandpa who is a former king of Dundrasul and who is traveling along with a daughter of another kingdom who helped you escape the castle when you were an infant. Now, as someone who has played a large number of JRPGs since I was a kid, I can openly say that while a vast majority of the main plot isn't so much boring, but what it is very predictable. And the actual story surrounding the Luminary character is the least interesting aspect of the game's entire plot, and yet it has to be the primary focus. One of the biggest issues that I personally have had with game stories is that the fact that this character is nameless and doesn't really talk at all. The idea of someone being the chosen one has been done so many times in RPGs that since your character doesn't talk or have an official name, it makes this character feel more like a plot device rather than a fully realized character. Now, I don't know if this is the normal way that main protagonists are handled throughout the Dragon Quest franchise, but other RPG franchises have been able to pull this off without sacrificing the requirement of giving the main protagonist a personality of their own. That way they feel like a real character. It's shocking to me that literally every single one of your allies that you gain throughout the entire game has a far more interesting backstory to tell than what is ultimately the primary goal for the main protagonist to achieve. The only time the game's plot does something really unique that I wasn't expecting doesn't happen until after you beat the game, and it was so refreshing to see this plot point happen that it almost made the first 40 hours totally worth the journey. When it comes to the actual gameplay of Dragon Quest XI, it checks all the boxes that one would expect for any great JRPG to get right. There is a wonderful amount of exploration that isn't fully open world, but instead has several important locations including towns that run on pathways, but the individual maps for specific section areas is quite big and you are free to venture off the main roads at any time to explore. You have several options of transportation that you can use, from riding your horse on the main maps to venturing out to the open seas on your ship, and even being able to ride on a gigantic magical flying whale later on in the game. There are several quests that you can agree to take on by speaking to specific NPCs, and for the most part the rewards can be worth the effort. When it comes to equipment, you can either buy them from the local stores in a majority of the towns that you visit, or if you visit a campsite and have the proper materials, you can actually forge all of your weapons and equipment, and should you be able to forge a weapon perfectly, it will be granted a number of additional points. You can even improve existing weapons that you have stored and upgrade them should you choose. Leveling up is pretty standard, with experience points giving you access to skill points that then you can use to gain new abilities and special attacks. The unique factor being the specific characters can only use specific weapons and abilities, and special attacks are locked for only that particular weapon. The only frustrating aspect of the gameplay that I've found is with the combat system. Now, it's not to say that it's bad, but it's very inconsistent. Now, combat is operated on a free roam turn-based system. During battle, you have access to up to 4 characters at any time and can switch them out whenever you want. Now this is an absolutely fantastic idea because it's reminiscent of something like Final Fantasy X, which is my current favorite JRPG of all time. You have the option to either control each member one at a time, or if you're someone like me, can actually choose to operate only one character and choose the tactical options for each of the other characters that can perform during combat, which is very helpful because now you don't have to micromanage the other characters and can just focus on what you're doing. The problem I have is with the enemies and how they respond to the free roaming system. Now, as you move your characters around, there are some enemies that will chase you down to attack you specifically, and there are some enemies that use magical attacks that can lock onto your position, and there are even bosses that can actually attack everything within the free roaming zone, but there are just as many enemies and bosses that have focused direction attacks that should not be able to hit you. If an enemy is locked onto one of your party members and attacks them, and you just so happen to be standing behind the enemy, which means that logically you should not be taking any damage, but this varies from battle to battle. Sometimes the free roaming will work and sometimes it won't. I have literally won and lost boss fights whether or not the free roaming was playing a factor, and while at 40 hours it was something that I eventually adjusted to, that still didn't make it any less annoying than it was at the very beginning of the game. Game design wise, Dragon Quest XI looks fantastic, with a good amount of detail given to the various locations and towns that you will travel to. The character design specifically was really unique and stood out to me, given to the fact that one of the artists for the game was Akira Toriyama of Dragon Ball popularity. However, the soundtrack itself for the most part was very forgettable and generic, though I have to admit I did not run into any technical issues of any kind, so I would give it some credit for being a very smooth running RPG in that sense. Now in conclusion, Dragon Quest XI is by no means a bad game. It is a very well put together game. I just think that it lacks any sort of ambition or risk factor. Since this is coming from Square Enix, anyone who is a big Final Fantasy fan can literally go through this game's plot and easily pick out elements that were ripped directly from past games. And just because you're taking elements from past games and then putting them all into one game and mixing them up doesn't really make you very unique. It just kind of makes you seem very inconsistent and at least seems like you don't have any faith in yourself. The main protagonist, I understand that maybe the idea that they were going with is that I'm supposed to be the main character, but I don't think that idea works very well for me nowadays. Maybe that would have worked for an older game, but when I play a JRPG, I want to actually go on an adventure with an entire great cast of characters, and if it's centering around the main protagonist, then the main protagonist needs to have some level of personality, and this character simply doesn't. And again, the plot really, at least for me, doesn't even pick up and do anything unique until after you beat the game. And heck, since this was a 40-hour game for me, by that point, I was ready to check out, despite the fact that you had something that was very, very special. Gameplay-wise, again, love the turn-based system, love the free roaming, comes from two of my all-time favorite RPGs of all time, being Final Fantasy X, kind of mixing with Ni no Kuni, but this system just can't seem to make up its mind. Visually, again, looks fine, but I think that the biggest sin that this game pulls out is that it plays it too safe. This is simply not a game that I think that if anyone isn't already a fan of the Dragon Quest franchise, I do not believe that this is the type of game that I would suggest you try and will make you a Dragon Quest fan. Now, do I say that you shouldn't play it? I think it's worth a rent, but this is certainly not something that I would recommend to any of my viewers unless you're already a fan, because if you know what you're getting yourself into, then a lot of this shouldn't really surprise you. Now, if I had to give Dragon Quest XI a rating, it's kind of in the middle for me, so just to be nice, because it is an RPG, a specific JRPG, in which I hold my standards for these type of games very, very high because it is my favorite genre, I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10. Again, I do not think this is a full price game. If you manage to find this on sale or feel like renting it, I would suggest you try the game out that way. And while this particular game didn't really make me a fan of the Dragon Quest franchise, it might not be the same thing for you. You might be a fan of it right from the get-go, but just for me, it didn't work too well. Now, if you like my game review, feel free to like, comment down below, and please subscribe to track my future game reviews. And please press some of the links in the description down below to follow me on Twitter and friend me on Facebook. Or if you have any ideas for future videos you'd like me to do, be sure to share those ideas in the comments down below as well. And like always, thank you guys for watching. You're awesome, and I will see you next time.